Alleged rabbi Chaim Mentz declared the recently slain Charlie Kirk to be an Abraham of our time. But there's a problem with this comparison that reveals something disturbing about how religious authority really works. Our father Abraham's most famous act was pleading with God to spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, begging for mercy even for his enemies. He was literally called by God to be a blessing to all nations, not just his own people. Meanwhile, Charlie publicly stated that empathy is weakness and dangerous. He promoted supremacist ideologies that directly contradict Abraham's universal mercy. So why would Rabbi call a man who rejects empathy the modern Abraham? There's actually a figure in history who was clearly and explicitly sent as mercy to all humanity, the Prophet Muhammad. His followers span every continent and race, yet the same religious authorities who praise Kirk reject this universal messenger. Why? This selective praise isn't accidental hypocrisy. It's part of a calculated pattern that's been operating for thousands of years. Praising politically useful figures while rejecting authentic spiritual authority that threatens existing power structures. This pattern began with a single family crime that became the template for corrupting every major religion that followed. One brother's jealousy established the playbook that's still being used today, the betrayal that started it all. Everyone knows the story. Judah sold his brother Joseph into slavery, but what they don't teach you is that slavery wasn't Judah's first plan. The real story reveals the psychological template that would corrupt every major religion that followed. Here's what actually happened. Judah, a grown adult consumed with hate, wasn't trying to save Joseph through slavery. He wanted his little brother dead. The plan was simple. Throw Joseph in a pit and let him starve. This wasn't a moment of anger. It was calculated murder driven by pure jealousy of a child who had divine dreams and their father's love. Only when traders happened to pass by and discovered the starving child in the well did Judah change his plan. Not out of mercy, out of greed. He realized he could profit from his brother's suffering instead of just causing his death. This opportunistic thinking became the blueprint for religious corruption. If you can't eliminate the truth, find a way to hijack it or profit from it. After selling Joseph, they didn't just hope to get away with it. They actively manufactured evidence, bloodying Joseph's coat and presenting it to their father as proof of death. They controlled the narrative completely. Distraught Jacob was led to believe his son was dead, while Joseph was actually rising to power in Egypt. Judah had created the perfect template. First, eliminate authentic spiritual authority. Second, profit from the destruction. Third, manufacture false evidence. Fourth, control the narrative to deceive leadership. This wasn't just a family crime. It was the birth of systematic manipulation. Here's what's truly sinister. They didn't just get away with this crime. They rewrote the entire family history to make Judah's psychology seem normal and even admirable. They turned Jacob into a trickster to cover for Judah's behavior. One fake story normalized deception for thousands of years. Quick question. Did Jacob deceive his blind father Isaac to steal Esau's blessing? If you answered yes, congratulations. You just fell for 4,000-year-old propaganda. The Bible never actually says Jacob tricked anyone. Here's what really happened. Before Jacob and Esau were even born, God told their mother Rebekah that the older son would serve the younger. Isaac knew this prophecy. When he blessed Jacob, he was fulfilling God's plan, not being deceived by a clever trick. Isaac knew exactly who he was blessing. If the Bible doesn't say Jacob was deceptive, where did this story come from? Simple. They needed to rewrite history. By making Jacob into a clever trickster who used deception to get ahead, they created a false precedent that would normalize Judah's actual crimes. This was brilliant psychological manipulation. If the patriarchs were tricksters, then Judah's attempted murder of Joseph becomes clever family strategy. If deception runs in the bloodline, then Judah's betrayal looks like inherited wisdom rather than sociopathy. The rewrite campaign worked perfectly. Instead of seeing Judah as an attempted murderer driven by jealousy, people now see him as having chutzpah, audacious cleverness to be admired. They turned a cautionary tale about the dangers of envy into a celebration of strategic deception. But here's what's truly disturbing. This exact same method of hijacking authentic spiritual movements was used again centuries later. Someone else eliminated the original leadership and rewrote the entire story. The apostle who stole Christianity. Let's see how Saul used that exact playbook to steal Christianity from Jesus' own family. Jesus was crystal clear about his mission. He explicitly told his disciples he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel and commanded them not to go to the Gentiles. His brother James led the original church following Jewish law. This was authentic Christianity, Torah-observant believers who saw Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. Then Paul shows up and says something shocking about the original apostles, people who actually lived with Jesus for years. Quote, "What they were makes no difference to me." He's literally dismissing the eyewitness testimony of Jesus' closest companions and family members who knew him personally. Paul didn't just disagree with minor details. He flipped everything upside down and made the way of Christ unpalatable to the Torah-observant believers in the Messiah Jesus. He abandoned circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, and Torah requirements. He targeted Gentiles despite Jesus' explicit prohibition. The original Christians became Judaizers in their own movement. Imagine being called a deviant for following the founder's actual teachings. This is identical to Judah's playbook. Step 1. Eliminate authentic spiritual authority. Paul marginalized James and the original apostles. Step 2. Control the narrative. Paul's letters became the new foundation. Step 3. Rewrite history. Later churches claimed Paul's version was always the original plan. Today's Christianity is actually Pauline theology with the trademarked Jesus label. The faith-alone doctrine, Gentile focus, and abandonment of Jewish law all come from Paul, not Jesus. The original Judeo-Christian church, led by Jesus' own family, was completely erased from history and replaced with Paul's creation. Paul's hijacking wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic pattern that goes back millennia. And there's actual mathematical evidence that proves this corruption campaign is far more extensive than anyone realizes. We are at a unique point in history where we can consciously notice the MO with its pattern of corruption and understand the strategy. Let's see how religious corruption caused the enslavement. When Joseph became vizier of Egypt, his authentic monotheistic understanding began influencing the royal court. This divine influence reached Pharaoh Akhenaten, who initiated a revolutionary shift from Egypt's traditional polytheism to the worship of Aten, one god. This was a genuine spiritual awakening inspired by Joseph's presence. But Judah's faction had learned from their failure with Joseph. If you can't eliminate the prophet, control the prophet. They infiltrated Akhenaten's court as trusted advisors, positioning themselves as the new religious elite who would help implement the monotheistic revolution. Once inside, they employed their standard corruption method. They convinced Akhenaten that he should claim direct prophetic revelation rather than crediting Joseph's influence. They rebranded authentic monotheism as Atenism, Akhenaten's personal religious innovation, completely erasing Joseph's role in the spiritual transformation. This was brilliant manipulation. Akhenaten became the public face of monotheism, while Judah's faction held the real power behind the throne. They created a competing version of monotheism, where Joseph had no role and they controlled the religious hierarchy. It was the perfect setup for total narrative control. Here's stunning linguistic proof of this timeline. The Quran precisely uses both king and pharaoh when referring to Egyptian rulers during Joseph's time. This matches the exact historical transition when Egypt changed from using king to pharaoh as the royal title during Akhenaten's revolutionary reign. 7th century Arabia couldn't have known this historical detail without divine preservation. But corrupted spirituality always fails. When Akhenaten's artificial monotheism collapsed, the traditional Egyptian priesthood rose up in revolt. They deposed Akhenaten and enslaved his entire new ruling elite, including all the Hebrews who got caught in Judah's disaster, both guilty and innocent alike, making this event the only time in Egyptian history where the ruling elite and administrators are enslaved. Here's the ultimate irony they desperately tried to hide. The very oppression Moses had to rescue the Hebrews from was directly caused by Judah's corruption campaign. They created the disaster, then erased their role in causing it. The mathematical evidence, linguistic precision, and historical patterns all prove the same devastating truth. According to traditional teaching, 400 years passed between Joseph and Moses, during which the Hebrew population exploded from Jacob's small family into millions of people. This massive population growth supposedly justified Pharaoh's fear and the need for oppression. But the math tells a very different story. Here's where the story falls apart and into place mathematically. When Pharaoh wants to control Hebrew births, he assigns exactly 3 midwives, Shiphrah, Puah, and one unnamed, to handle all Hebrew deliveries. Think about this logically. How many births can 3 midwives actually handle? 3 midwives working full-time could handle maybe 500 births maximum per year. For a population of millions, you would need hundreds of midwives, not 3. The math only works if the Hebrew population was small, maybe 3,000 to 5,000 people total, not millions. If the population was small enough for 3 midwives to handle, then we're talking about 3 or 4 generations between Joseph and Moses, not centuries. The artificial time gap was inserted to hide something crucial: the direct connection between Joseph's influence in Egypt and what happened next. The mathematical evidence proves there was a direct causal relationship between Joseph's rise to power, the corruption that followed, and the Hebrew enslavement. The centuries-long gap was fabricated to obscure this connection and protect the reputation of those who caused the disaster. The fake timeline wasn't just an error, it was a deliberate cover-up of the most catastrophic corruption campaign in ancient history, one that directly caused the slavery Moses had to rescue them from. But the cover-up didn't stop with hiding their role in Egyptian slavery. They systematically corrupted divine names, scriptural accounts, and spiritual practices to erase all evidence of authentic authority. Quick test. What does the name Ismael mean? If you said God will hear, you've been taught a lie. The original meaning was name of El, meaning Ismael literally carries God's name. This wasn't an accident. Every major divine name in Scripture was systematically distorted to hide who was meant to carry divine authority. The pattern is everywhere once you see it. Emmanuel doesn't mean God with us. It means belief in El. Raziel doesn't mean God is my secret. It means secrets of El. They systematically converted divine name-bearers, people who actively carry aspects of God's name, into passive recipients of divine actions. This wasn't random translation error, it was strategic, meant to disconnect people from divine names and authority. By hiding that certain individuals actually carry aspects of the divine name itself, they obscured the original truth about spiritual authority. If people realized some figures were literal name-bearers of divine attributes, it would bruise their ego and threaten the corrupt religious hierarchy. Ismael is just an illegitimate son whom Abraham didn't love. Allegedly, Abraham's name Halil gets compressed and unrecognizable. He was given the name Halil by God. It means friend of El, Hallel. This prevented people from recognizing that Abraham's friendship with God was connected to carrying the divine name architecture. They banned the practice that made Abraham a friend to God. The final stroke was prohibiting Zikrullah, the frequent remembrance of Allah that made Abraham God's friend. They made divine names lost in transliteration and severed people's ability to achieve direct divine connection. If you can't properly invoke divine names, you can't threaten corrupt religious intermediaries. Here's what they never expected. While their corruption campaign succeeded in Hebrew tradition, it completely failed in Arabic. One language preserved the authentic divine name architecture with stunning accuracy. Every Muslim unconsciously speaks the complete biblical names of God they tried to redact. Prepare to have your mind blown. The word Allah breaks down as Al-Anilah, which directly corresponds to El and Elo, the same God worshipped by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, peace and blessings unto them. Muslims aren't worshipping a different deity. They're using the preserved original divine names. But here's where it gets truly incredible. Let's break down the name Allah. Hu Akbar. We get 3 words, Al, La, Hu, which preserves El, Elo, and Yahweh. That's all the major biblical names of God in one phrase. Allahu is a triune structured name for God. El represents destination, Elo represents origin, and Yahweh represents the breath of life. Muslims invoke the complete divine name daily. Every day, nearly 2 billion Muslims unconsciously invoke and preserve the complete biblical divine name architecture that corruption campaigns tried to destroy. Every call to prayer, every moment of worship, every Allahu Akbar is testimony against the lies and evidence of authentic preservation through Ismail's lineage. Here's the ultimate divine irony. While attempting to eliminate Ismail's covenant legitimacy and cast him as the neurotic, stubborn bastard son, Judah's corruption campaign accidentally ensured that Ismail's descendants would become the carriers of the authentic divine truth they themselves had corrupted. The son they rejected preserves what they destroyed. The appearance of Prophet Muhammad through Ismail's lineage represents the completion of a divine plan. Just as Hagar received convergent revelation through multiple channels, Islam operates through the same divine methodology: prophetic revelation, linguistic preservation, cultural transmission, and daily practice embedding the complete divine name architecture. Islam isn't a new religion trying to compete with Judaism and Christianity. It's the preservation and completion of the authentic Abrahamic tradition that systematic corruption tried to destroy. The evidence is in the linguistics, the mathematics, and the divine names themselves. Here is why they're waiting for someone to accomplish what's already been accomplished. Let's check the traditional Jewish requirements for the Messiah. Military conquest and lasting political order? Check. Global spread of monotheism, eliminating idolatry? Check. Universal religious law and unified community? Check. Influence spanning continents and lasting over a millennium? Check. Every single messianic criterion was fulfilled. The Prophet Muhammad accomplished messianic outcomes on a scale that surpassed even the wildest traditional expectations. From a single man in 7th century Arabia emerged a civilization spanning 3 continents, with nearly 2 billion followers today representing every race and nation on earth. This is messianic success by any objective measure. Here's the cognitive dissonance. Many Jewish authorities acknowledge Muhammad as a legitimate prophet sent to bring monotheism to all Gentile nations. They recognize his divine mission and global success, but they maintain he wasn't sent to Jews specifically, so they continue waiting for their own universal Messiah. This creates an impossible logical position, waiting for a future universal Messiah to accomplish what has already been accomplished by the universal prophet they acknowledge. It's like waiting for someone to invent the wheel while standing next to a perfectly functional wheel and insisting it doesn't count because it wasn't invented by your tribe. Unlike other prophetic missions that were ethnically specific, Quran explicitly claims from the beginning that he was Mustafa, meaning the one sent to all humanity. Quran 7:158, "Say, O mankind, I am the messenger of Allah to you all." This wasn't a later expansion as in Christianity. It was the foundational universal mission that accomplished messianic objectives. But here's where the irony gets even deeper. While rejecting Muhammad's prophetic authority, they actually restructured their entire religious framework using his organizational principles. The most famous Jewish philosopher basically copied Islam. By the medieval period, Judaism faced an existential crisis. After over a millennium without the temple, the religion was struggling to maintain coherence in diaspora. It lacked systematic theology, comprehensive legal codes, and rational philosophical frameworks. Enter Moses Maimonides, also known as Rambam and Second Moses of Judaism, who would save Judaism by plagiarizing the Arab prophet he couldn't accept. Maimonides systematically adopted Islamic intellectual frameworks. His 13 principles of faith mirrored Islamic creedal formulations. His Mishnah Torah followed Islamic legal codification methods. His Guide for the Perplexed used Islamic philosophical approaches. He essentially created a Jewish version of Islamic systematic theology. Maimonides' rational approach to understanding God and prophecy directly followed Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes. His detailed taxonomy of prophetic levels matched Islamic models. Even his concept of Moses as the greatest prophet used Islamic hierarchical frameworks, placing Quran's most frequently mentioned prophet Moses at the top. Through Maimonides' structural borrowing, Muhammad effectively became Judaism's second Moses, providing the organizational and intellectual framework that made post-temple Judaism viable. The Mishnah Torah functions like a Jewish Quran, and Maimonides' systematic approach mirrors Islamic methodology throughout. Yet if a Jew finds beauty in Quranic eloquence, the rabbis claim it was taken from them. Here's the peak irony. Maimonides criticized Muslims for not accepting rabbinic authority and interpretation, preferring direct scriptural access. Yet the same Hebrew Bible warns that the lying pen of the scribes corrupted scripture. So he defended the very class Jeremiah said corrupted the texts, while adopting the framework of those who claimed to bypass corruptions. This pattern of adopting Islamic methods while rejecting Islamic authority continues today. The very frameworks used to critique Islam were borrowed from Islamic intellectual tradition. Let's see how these same age-old manipulation tactics operate in contemporary politics and religion. The corruption methods pioneered by Judah 4,000 years ago didn't disappear. They became the standard playbook for religious and political manipulation. Every generation faces the same tactics: infiltrate authentic movements, corrupt from within, control narratives, project your psychology, and eliminate alternatives. First, infiltrate genuine reform movements by positioning yourself as part of the new leadership. Gain trust and access by appearing to support the authentic cause. This is exactly what the elitist faction did in Egypt. They became Akhenaten's wise advisors, while planning to corrupt his monotheistic revolution from within. Once inside, gradually change the core message while claiming to preserve authentic tradition. Convince leaders to take personal credit for ideas that came from others. Make yourself indispensable to the narrative. Paul used this exact method, eliminating Jesus' actual teachings while claiming to preserve Christianity. Rewrite historical accounts to make your actions seem inevitable and justified. Create false precedents like the trickster Jacob story that normalize deception. Control education and media to ensure your version becomes the accepted truth. Make original sources inaccessible or discredited. Rewrite historical figures to match your own character flaws. If everyone in history was deceptive and manipulative like you, then your behavior seems normal. Turn heroes into villains and victims into perpetrators. Make corruption appear to be universal human nature. Finally, systematically discredit or eliminate any alternative sources of truth or authority. Make competing narratives seem dangerous, extremist, or antisocial. Create social pressure against investigating alternative explanations. Protect your monopoly on acceptable truth. The good news: once you recognize the pattern, you can protect yourself. Look for authentic voices being suppressed, dead figures being rewritten, mathematical impossibilities in official stories, and linguistic evidence being ignored. Truth has a way of preserving itself. Every generation faces the same test. What will you choose? The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Linguistic proof shows Arabic preserved what Hebrew corrupted. Mathematical proof exposes fabricated timelines. Historical proof reveals identical corruption patterns across millennia. Psychological proof demonstrates systematic victim blaming and projection. The pattern is clear, the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Linguistic proof shows Arabic preserved what Hebrew corrupted. Mathematical proof exposes fabricated timelines. Historical proof reveals identical corruption patterns across millennia. Psychological proof demonstrates systematic victim blaming and projection. The pattern is clear. The power struggle they've desperately tried to hide for 4,000 years is now exposed. Authentic, divine connection that doesn't need corrupt intermediaries versus religious control systems that profit from spiritual manipulation. Direct access to divine truth threatens every corrupt religious hierarchy. What they fear most is people recognizing that the divine names are still accessible, that authentic spiritual connection doesn't require corrupt intermediaries, that Ismael's lineage preserved what they corrupted, and that their religious authority is built on systematic falsification spanning millennia. Every day, nearly 2 billion people unconsciously testify to the preserved truth. Every Allahu Akbar contains the complete biblical divine name architecture. Every call to prayer proves the linguistic preservation. Every recognition of this pattern breaks their monopoly on religious narrative. This isn't just ancient history, It's the test every generation faces. Will you choose authentic spiritual truth even when it challenges existing power structures? Will you follow evidence wherever it leads? Will you break the cycle of corruption or perpetuate it? The pattern is exposed. The choice is yours. The corruption campaign that began with Judah's jealousy continued through Paul's hijacking and operates in modern religious political manipulation has been fully exposed. The linguistic evidence, mathematical proof, and historical patterns all point to the same truth. The question isn't whether the evidence exists, it's whether you're brave enough to follow truth wherever it leads. The ultimate divine irony: those who tried to steal spiritual legitimacy created the very system that preserves and proves authentic truth. The evidence speaks for itself. The truth is preserved through the lineage they rejected. Thank you all for subscribing.